So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Nolder. I'm the director of the Transportation Center at UMass, and thrilled to have everybody here today for the first of 5 in terms of the Governor's Commission on the Future of Transportation listening session. So the plan for today, hopefully everybody has a sense of what we're in for, but the idea is to talk a little bit about the work of the Commission, the role and the mission in terms of what the Commission has been tasked with doing. We'll hear a little bit from some of the commissioners, a brief introductory video that outlines a little bit of what the Commission does. We've got some experts in the area of automated vehicles, automated connected vehicles, to provide some context. And then the reality is, for the bulk of the time today, we want to hear from all of you, right? This is a listening session. If you haven't already done so and you'd like to speak, we'd encourage you to sneak to the back of the room and grab a number, just so that we can have an orderly process in terms of who's going to speak when. If you don't grab a number now, it doesn't mean that you won't have an opportunity to speak later, but we do want to facilitate and manage that process a little bit. So to kick us off this afternoon, I'd like to introduce somebody in this room who probably doesn't need much of an introduction. I think most folks are familiar with Secretary Stephanie Pollack of mass.gov. And I'd like to bring her up. She's a commission member, and we'll talk about the role of the commission and their work.
So thank you, Mark. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. Welcome to, this is actually the first of 5 listening sessions that the Governor's Commission on the Future of Transportation is going to be holding. We're actually holding all 5 of them at the different UMass campuses, which gives us great geographic breadth to hear from perspectives from different parts of the Commonwealth. And then each of these listening sessions, we've chosen to focus on one of the major topic areas that the Commission is focusing on, but we're happy to get people's comments on any aspect of transportation in the future that they want to talk to the Commission members of. We have several Commission members who've been kind enough to join us today. To my left is Karen Sawyer-Kennard, she is the Executive Director of the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. To her left is Sandra Shaheen, who's a Hamden resident and who serves as the CEO of the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority. And then to her left is Andrew Hoagland, who is a member of the Williamstown Select Board and involved in various town committees and board secretary of the Massachusetts Selectmen Association and a longtime environmental attorney. So these are just some of our commission members. We're sort of splitting ourselves up so that everybody covers different meetings. I think we're going to start by showing you a little video about the commission, and then I'll fill in a couple of the details. And then for today's listening session, our major topic is autonomous vehicles. And Mike at the UMass Transportation Center, which is just a great partner for all the work we do at the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, has put together a little panel so that the commission members as well as the public can learn a little bit about the state of play on autonomous vehicles, and then we'll get into the listening to the members of the public.
Transportation in the Commonwealth is not important for what it is, but rather for what it does. Gets people where they need to go and shapes the economy of communities. But transportation as we know it is changing. Through advancements in technology like ride-sharing programs and autonomous vehicles, shifts in the state's demographics with an aging population, and changes in the environment with more frequent major weather events.
Earlier this year, I issued an executive order establishing the Commission on the Future of Transportation in the Commonwealth to address these and other challenges that Massachusetts may face in the future. This diverse team of 19 cross-sector leaders will help us better develop policy and make informed transportation decisions based on how changes in technology, climate, land use, and our economy will affect transportation patterns and the needs of constituents.
The governor has asked this commission to do something that is very unusual for state government. It's to look 20 years in the future. It's not looking at today, it's not looking at a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. 5 years from now for most of state government is a long time away. We're doing something that is very unusual, and to think about what the world might be 20 years from now.
It's a fascinating time in transportation. Technology is changing, the demographics of the people we serve are changing, our climate is even changing, and the Commission can really help MassDOT and the MBTA understand how to account for all those changes as we operate our services and as we make investments for the future.
The work of the Transportation Commission will be hugely influential on the future work of energy and environmental affairs because currently transportation accounts for up to 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions across the Commonwealth. As we transition into a more electrified transportation fleet, this will be hugely helpful in us trying to meet the terms of our carbon reduction goals. The work will also help us to make the transportation network, the physical structures that exist today, be more resilient and more adapted to the forces of a changing climate.
Well, I think that transportation is really the cornerstone to our economy. You know, we have to move people, we have to move goods, we have to just make sure the economy thrives, and transportation is so critical to that. To me, the most exciting element of the Commission's work is the fact that we can look to the future and aspire to the transportation system that we all want.
I look forward to working with all of you as we build a stronger, better, forward-looking transportation system here in Massachusetts.
Share your thoughts and suggestions, and learn about our public engagement sessions at mass.gov/futureoftransportation.
The governor's executive order and his charge to the commission was clear, as Commission Chair Steve Kadish said in the introductory video. We're really not looking at the near-term future at all. In fact, the time frame that we're focusing on begins in the year 2020 and ends in 2040. The governor didn't ask us for any recommendations around specific projects or investments. What the commission is focusing on is sort of three big areas. The first is, what are the facts and trends that we should take account of and that the governor and the Commonwealth's leadership should be aware of when they think about transportation in the year 2040 and the future of transportation in the Commonwealth. So we're happy if folks either through the website or in today's session or otherwise bring to our attention any facts or trends they think we should be aware of. The second big focus of the commission has been on developing a set of plausible future scenarios. And we know that the transportation field is changing rapidly, and the Commission's goal is not to sort of posit one particular future and then go to the governor and say, here's what we think the future is going to be. Instead, it's to look at a series of scenarios that are driven by different potential changes or different rates of change in things like technology, climate, demographics, and other factors. And then the third thing, and the thing I'm sure most of the people in this room are the most interested in, is by December 1st, the Commission will prepare a report to the Governor, Lieutenant Governor, and the leadership of the Commonwealth on recommendations based on those facts and trends and those plausible scenarios for things the Commonwealth should be doing to prepare for and advance the transportation future or futures that the Commission will have been exploring for most of calendar year 2018. So while everyone who has joined us for the afternoon is free to talk on whatever topics you want to bring to our attention, I do want to make it clear that if your primary interest is in any kind of short-term operating issues or advocacy for specific near-term capital projects, there are other processes which we're happy to tell you about that you can engage in on those, but that's really not the focus of this commission. In terms of subject matter area, the Commission is looking at a number of areas, technology areas like autonomous vehicles or the electrification of the transportation system, demographics and other context-setting areas, land use, population change, employment change, to better understand the kind of place the Commonwealth will be in the year 2040. And they're looking at, obviously, as Secretary Beaton mentioned, climate change and climate resiliency are huge issues for the future of transportation and the future of the Commonwealth and the future of the planet, so that there will be robust recommendations, I'm sure, in those areas. And then finally, changes in what I would call the service model for transportation. Where does transit come in the future? How do things, mobility as a service, transportation network companies, bike sharing, all those different kinds of things that we sort of see emergently now, how does that play out by the year 2040? So those are the sort of 5 different major areas that the Commission is looking at. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mike, and we're going to start today's conversation, which is really to focus the beginning of today's session for the benefit of the Commission members and you as well on autonomous vehicles, which is an area that the Commission has been exploring and that we know is one of the more intriguing questions about, where are we today and where are we likely to be by 2040. Mike?
All right, thank you, Secretary Pollack. So, as the Secretary mentioned, we've invited a panel of experts to be here with us today. Although we've posed them with a particular challenge. We've asked them to be incredibly brief and keep their remarks to less than 5 minutes. We've also taken away PowerPoint presentations altogether. No, with the idea being that their role here today is to provide context for the conversation that we're about to have. And they're doing all sorts of excellent work. My guess is some of you may have some questions for them during the course of the conversation today. That's certainly okay. That's welcome. We wanted them to provide the opening remarks, set the stage, and provide some thought-provoking comments based upon their experiences and their work in and around automated and connected vehicles. And so with that, I'll introduce our first panelist. Professor Shlomo Zilberstein is in computer science. He's also the Associate Dean for Research and Engagement here at UMass Amherst. He has a PhD in computer science from UC Berkeley, and his research focuses on the foundation and applications of automated planning, particularly methods that allow complex systems to optimize their decisions while coping with uncertainty, missing information, and limited computational resources. And so in particular, he's worked with 2 different vehicle manufacturers. With Nissan, he's developed scalable algorithms for autonomous vehicles crossing complex intersections while interacting with pedestrians and other vehicles. And in collaboration with GM, he's developed models that facilitate smoother transfer of control between automation and human driving. So, Professor Zilberstein? Yep, sure.
Okay, good afternoon. So my lab, my students and I have been working with Nissan on developing their autonomous vehicle, and I wanted to share some of the thoughts based on that experience that's been going on over the last couple of years. We've been focusing on the decision-making part. It's called sometimes the mid-level decision-making, which is the minute-to-minute or second-to-second decision whether to stop, go, edge, yield, and so on. And we focused on some of the hardest challenges involving the behavior and decision-making of autonomous vehicles at intersections, where they need to interact with other vehicles, with pedestrians, with bicyclists, and deal with any number of challenges. You can think about the four-way stop intersection as an example, where it's not only the rules, but also some social norms that should affect the behavior of the car, and this presents a lot of challenges for AI today, because it really requires recognition of gestures and the behavior of other cars, not just the very movement of the other cars and so on. We have been dealing in this context with many sources of uncertainty, including the fact that cars and pedestrians could be occluded, meaning you may only see parts of them. You may not be able to recognize them very well. It's much harder to even recognize their intention. A pedestrian with their back to the maybe road needs to be interpreted in a different way than a pedestrian that is about to cross, and so on. The vision behind autonomous vehicle is quite ambitious, as you know. It's designing is the idea of having fleets of vehicles, maybe electrical vehicles, providing affordable, safe transportation option that is offering safety and less congestions and lower pollution, radically new designs of cars that would allow passengers to rest or work or entertain themselves. The predictions about what may happen are quite wild, and they include things like your grandchildren will not need to know how to drive, safety will be extremely high, potentially driving the auto industry to extinction, manual driving will become unconventional, could be outlawed in certain areas, and there are now predictions that AV sales will reach 95% of market share by 2040. This is pretty close to the time frame that the Commission is focusing on. So it doesn't really matter if these will be exact or not. You can see that these kind of predictions indicate that very radical change is expected in transportation and in every other aspects of the economy and life in general that is affected by it. In practice, what we see is heavy investments, more than $80 billion in the past 2 years, in research mostly, and gradual but a very significant progress. Automakers promise to deliver, practically every major automaker says that within the next 3 to 5 years, they will have some form of autonomous cars offered to the public. Some say for urban deployment, some say for highway deployment, some think that one is easier than the other or makes more sense and so on. What you will notice is that it's always 3 to 5 years from now. It started that way. In 2012, the first prediction was made by Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, and he said that within 5 years, autonomous cars will be available for all. So that was last year. So it's not surprising. It's typical that with technologies like this, people overestimate the near-term progress and impact, and sometimes underestimate the long-term progress and impact. It's what's true today, and that is already remarkable on its own right, is that autonomous driving on clear, empty roads in a nice day like today is already solved. That can be done. But there are many challenges ahead. We are, in our work, we've been dealing with some of them. The main issue is that you need to deal with exceptions, and there isn't really a simple way. It's a known problem in AI. There isn't a simple way to develop a list of exceptions. And there isn't a model of the real world, and there is not going to be, regardless of how much data and learning you're going to deploy. And there is the problem of unknown unknowns that was described by Ramsfeld, if you remember in his book. The issue is that you need to deal with known unknowns, but also with unknown unknowns. So the late Marvin Minsky was a pioneering AI researcher, said that almost any error will completely paralyze a typical computer program, whereas a person whose brain has failed at some attempt to find some other way to proceed. I'm sorry, I probably misquoted. But basically he said, we rarely depend as people upon any one method. We usually know several different ways to do something, so that if one of them fails, there is always another. And that's what we need to develop in autonomous vehicle, a whole layer of techniques that work in parallel, what Minsky called the society of mind, and decide at any given time which one of them should prevail and what is the most sensible thing to do. The future of transportation requires a partnership between government, academia, and the private sector in many different ways, in investing in the research that is required, and there are many knowledge gaps still, in designing and building infrastructure that will make it easier and enable the deployment of autonomous vehicles and the future transportation solutions, and also, obviously, to enact policies and laws that will govern the new technology. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Silverstein. It gives me great privilege to introduce our next panelist. Professor Shannon Roberts is a human factors engineer. She's the director of the Human Performance Lab here on campus, which, a little plug, some of you will have the opportunity to visit and tour later if you'd like to take a peek at the driving simulator here on campus. Dr. Roberts is the director of that particular facility. Prior to joining us here at UMass, she was a technical member of the team at MIT's Lincoln Lab in the Cyber Analytics and Decision Systems Group. She has her PhD and MS from the University of Wisconsin. Her area of expertise within human factors is with experience studying the interaction between humans and systems in transportation safety. So, Professor Roberts.
So today I'm going to offer some insight into the area of human factors needs for autonomous vehicles. And I'm going to do that by asking you guys a series of questions and providing a bit of commentary in between. So your responses will hopefully make you think really deeply about what the future has in store for us. So this is an active session. If I ask a question, you guys can actually raise your hands. Don't be timid. Okay, so the first question is, who drives to work every day? Okay, so according to the 2013 census, 86% of Americans commuted to work every day by car. In addition to commuting, many people use their vehicles for vacations. So just speaking personally, I just returned from Montreal last night, and of course, since it's only a 4-hour drive from here, I decided to take my car versus a train or a plane. So second question, who would like an autonomous vehicle? Okay, seems like there's maybe a little more hands there. So not having to drive sounds really, really great. I could have been so much more productive in my 4-hour trip to Montreal if I didn't have to drive. Though you may not realize it, in the car that you have today, sometimes they have features that are considered autonomous. So for example, we have adaptive cruise control. So this is a special version of cruise control where it keeps a safe distance between your car and the car in front. So adaptive cruise control has been available for quite some time, and many of you guys probably use it. So even though we don't have fully autonomous vehicles on the road today, studies on driving assistance systems, which we do have, can give us insight into how people will respond to this type of technology. So for example, studies have shown that people turn on some driving assistance systems, like forward collision braking, and they turn off other systems, like lane departure warnings. So lane departure warnings aren't that popular because many people find them really annoying and irritating. So on top of that, systems sometimes aren't that good. So have you guys ever had a false alarm where a system cries wolf at you, but there's actually no problem? These are kind of common, and in the end, it leads you to not trust the system that you have in your vehicle. On the other hand, we have some systems that work way too well, and they cause drivers to do something really dangerous. So one study found that people who had adaptive headlights actually drove faster at night because the headlights allowed them to see farther down the road. Okay, here's the third question. Who would like to be driven versus driving yourselves? So if you notice, that's fewer hands than the last question. So people who say they would like an autonomous vehicle aren't really ready for the changes that it will introduce. Although being chauffeured sounds really great, it's not the same as having the experience and the thrill of driving. For those of you who got your driver's license and you saw it as a rite of passage, think about what having your driver's license will mean in 2040. Will it be useless? We don't really know. Okay, here's the last question. Who can afford a brand new $50,000 car right now? Oh, that's no one. Okay. So $50,000 is what you have to spend right now for a semi-autonomous vehicle. Though they offer tons of promise, they're going to be very expensive, at least initially. On top of that, they only work under certain conditions. For example, the Tesla Autopilot or the Cadillac Super Cruise only work on the highway, even though people use them in situations that they shouldn't. Lastly, surveys have shown that a very specific type of person wants an autonomous vehicle. It's a young, high-income, tech-savvy man who lives in the city. That's it. So, in summary, a lot has to change for autonomous vehicles to really live up to their hype. Until they do, we're still going to be a bunch of drivers, not passengers. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. And continuing the panel this afternoon is our next speaker, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. It gives me a great privilege to introduce Professor Eric Gonzalez. He has a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to joining us here at UMass, he was a faculty member at Rutgers. His area of expertise is in modeling of urban street networks, and his interests are in operation management, design, safety, and sustainability of large-scale multimodal transportation systems. And he's going to talk about some of the context and applications of connected and autonomous vehicles. Professor Gonzalez.
Thanks. So I'm on the program invited to speak about autonomous vehicles and ride sharing, and I thought I would maybe start with a comment about terminology. That we call a lot of these services ride sharing. The idea that sharing is coming out of the sharing economy, and that rather than owning our own vehicles for our own exclusive use, we can share them. Whether somebody else owns them and we sort of buy into a system like a bike share program or a car share program, or we have app-based platforms that allow us to find people to carpool with. So if I'm going to drive somewhere, maybe I can be matched with somebody who needs a ride, and therefore I'd share the ride and somewhere I was already going. But one of the things we're seeing a really huge explosion of is transportation network companies, or TNCs, that offer a service that looks a lot more like a taxi, right? That looks more like a driver that wouldn't otherwise be on the road, providing a service, might more aptly be called ride sourcing. And so there's these different flavors of services that are emerging, and it's sort of relevant to our conversation about where this might go. And particularly ride sourcing is where we're likely to see big action with autonomous vehicles. Right, so currently, many of you are aware of what Uber and Lyft do. These TNCs are providing a platform that links drivers with passengers. So they don't actually hire the drivers themselves, they don't buy the cars themselves. They're providing a technology, a communication platform that people who want to provide the service can join and be matched with people who are looking for a ride. And people are using it sort of as a form of employment or supplemental employment. And there's some challenges with this type of a system because the company itself, although they match drivers to passengers, don't tell drivers exactly where to go. They don't have control over their labor market directly. And so in some ways they benefit from having an oversupply, right? If they have an oversupply of drivers in an area, that means that the response times are really good for customers, and it's really easy for people to find a ride when they want one. And each driver, likewise, is acting as their own profit maximizing agent, right? They're using this platform as part of a bigger company, but their own goal is to maximize the income for themselves. And this is leading to some challenges that might be alleviated with autonomous vehicles, but we'll have to see. A lot of this has to do with clustering in congested areas. So drivers have incentives to go to where they think the most business will be, and we're seeing, especially in our most congested urban centers, this problem is quite acute. So notably in the news, Manhattan has had a lot of challenges with declining traffic speeds. There are now more than 4 times as many TNC vehicles on the streets of Midtown than taxi cabs, conventional cabs. And those vehicles are vacant 40% of the time. Right? When they're not carrying a passenger, they're cruising around, not actually providing a productive mobility. Right? But that's using up our infrastructure. So when will you be able to buy an autonomous vehicle? We've heard a lot of range of predictions. It's certainly uncertain when you or I will have the opportunity to buy one for ourselves. But it's likely that we're going to see this first deployment through the ride sourcing companies. So Uber, Lyft, Waymo are all heavily invested in research in autonomous vehicles and putting them onto the roads. And it certainly seems to be part of their business model. Right? In the short term, these will be vehicles that are supervised by a trained driver or supervisor. And we've seen some highly publicized safety challenges associated with that. But in the long term, the goal is to get the driver out of the vehicle. And the driver, the labor, is the most expensive operating cost associated with transportation services. So this has the opportunity to reduce those costs substantially. An autonomous vehicle fleet could also be managed and controlled in a more system-oriented way, rather than individual agents acting on their own. So this gives us a lot of opportunities that we could be hopeful for. There's a lot of hope that this could improve mobility outcomes for underserved populations, people who currently don't have access to cars or are unable to drive, to locations that don't have other transit services, and times of day, late evening hours when conventional services aren't operating. And the opportunities to coordinate these fleets provide a lot of opportunity to realize efficiencies by pooling rides, getting more than one passenger into a vehicle together, solving first and last mile problems to get people to and from higher efficiency transit services, and coordinating the operation of these vehicles to achieve some sort of system-wide optimum in terms of routing, energy consumption, or other goals. But there's some risks. Urban networks are finite. There's only so many vehicles, individual vehicles that can fit on the streets and still move. And the evidence is that these ride sourcing services are increasing the vehicle miles that people are traveling or that are operating on the road. So will the increased vehicle miles outpace the gains in efficiency? That's an open question. These systems are, like we heard, more likely to be adopted by wealthier, technically equipped segments of our population. So will the outcomes be equitable? Are these systems going to be designed so that anybody can use them? So that they actually serve the needs of the elderly or people with disabilities? And then there's this third risk, I think, which is that a lot of the push now is developed on by private corporations. They have a profit motive. Certainly, efficient operations is good for their bottom line, but ultimately there are some challenges like congestion that are not well addressed by a private market on its own. And we can look to airports, for example, airport congestion, as an example of a market where larger airlines, they have a stake in keeping the congestion low, but in a competition and competitive behavior, we have over-congested airspace. And will profit maximizing companies behave in a way that will actually serve the public interest? So I want to leave you with some thoughts. Right, there's a lot that autonomous vehicle ride sourcing can do and that we can be optimistic about, but it's not likely to be a panacea of mobility and transportation. How will it affect traveling behavior and the activities and ways that we use our system? Are there unintended consequences that might fall from that? What role do we want these services to play in our transportation future? And what do we need to do to achieve the benefits that we're hoping for without suffering the risks and pitfalls? Who needs to be involved? What regulations or policies? How do those agents who have an interest in this need to interact and sort of plan for a system that serves all the needs of the users rather than sort of letting the efficiencies go to the pockets right now where they're serving certain needs very well and not necessarily others. So thank you.
All right, I'd like to thank each of our three panelists for doing exactly what we asked in terms of providing some context to set the stage for the conversation. I'd like to turn it back over to Secretary Pollack. I don't know if you want to say.
Yeah, so I think before we let the panel go, commission members privileged, do any of you have any questions you'd like to ask of the panelists? You guys good? Andy?
May I?
Yes, please. That's why we're here.
Yeah, I'll let you guys decide your answers to this. But there seems to be a gist that urban and suburban areas would be first for autonomous vehicles. I'm just curious what your view is on the feasibility of that technology in rural areas. Right, you leave this campus in half a mile in any direction and you are in rural areas. What do you see as the sort of technical challenges making that happen?
It depends. Does it work? So the main thing that comes to mind is that the infrastructure in rural areas is not as well maintained. I have in my car the ability to lane departure, but it doesn't know where the lanes are most of the time. You can actually see it. It shows in green, a green indicator when it is actually seeing the lanes. And half the time in our area, it's not seeing the lanes. On the highway and in many cities, it sees the lanes better because they're better maintained. But the technology is going to rely less and less on these kind of things, and there will be a multitude of other kind of sensors. The other thing is that we know that autonomous cars have more difficulty in the dark, and many of our roads are very dark at night. So I think that there will be additional challenges. Actually, the most likely scenario is deployment on highways, not in urban areas. In highways, where the likelihood of the passenger suddenly walking into the middle of the lane is not there, and it's more of a structured environment. And for tracking, for example, where when the truck gets close to a city, maybe the driver takes over and navigating the narrow roads, even either in the rural area or in dense populated areas.
Other thoughts?
So from a systems perspective, in terms of providing service, it's more efficient when there's a higher density of demand to serve. So if you were going to operate a taxi company, if you're a driver, you certainly would rather be in the center of Boston where there's lots of potential customers than out here in Western Massachusetts. And we see exactly that with Uber service, for example. That it really has a consequence for the availability of the service. And we're seeing this also in terms of availability for people with disabilities. So Uber has a program for wheelchair accessible vehicles. but it's susceptible to how many drivers want to provide those vehicles and provide the service. And so even in metropolitan areas where there's a lot of demand for conventional cars, there may not be enough wheelchair accessible vehicles to provide sort of complementary or comparable service for those users. And so the challenge in a rural area is when there's such more dispersed demand, it's going to be less cost effective. And so from a profit-oriented standpoint, it doesn't look as desirable. That's why we come later, but that's sort of a natural progression. But if we're hoping to realize the benefits in these types of environments where there's going to be some really acute transportation and mobility challenges, then that might be a role for some kind of intervention or incentives to try to make that change happen faster. Thank you.
Other questions? So I just have one question. I have many questions, but I just have one question that I want to ask. As we try to build plausible scenarios, are there things that we should be looking out for or taking into account to try to help judge better what the adoption time frame would be, right? So people say it's always 3 to 5 years, it's always 3 to 5 years. I went to MIT, tabletop fusion was always 10 years away. It's still 10 years away. But what can, as we look at facts and trends, as we put our scenarios together, are there factors that you would think about or look out for if it were today, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, that would help us better understand what the uptake rate is likely to be so that we can narrow down the range of uncertainty and help the governor understand when to start really needing to account for larger uptake as a matter of public policy?
So I'll speak really briefly on this. I think one of the things that a lot of people don't consider are the unintended secondary effects of the introduction of this new technology. So for example, we're not really considering the effects on the environment just yet. So I read a report from California where they said with the introduction of Uber, greenhouse emissions have actually gone up because there are more people on the roads driving. That wasn't something that was considered when they created this technology. As another example, if you have, going back to the example of where this is actually deployed, if it doesn't get deployed in rural areas, because people of a certain demographic typically live in those areas, we may have negative effects that are exacerbated because certain people have access and other people don't. So that can have an effect on families, on income potential, on a variety of things that isn't really considered when we first build technology.
I think it's going to be very hard to know when the technology might be right, and when that happens, it will be very quick. So the best advice is to start now, preparing for it, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of law, in terms of infrastructure, and in terms of learning, and slowly trying to predict the unintended consequences as well. So I think that's what many of the car companies realize, that they cannot afford ignoring this change. Nobody can afford ignoring it, even though nobody knows when it's going to materialize.
I'll drop one more.
Sure.
One thing that none of us have commented about yet, but that's relevant to autonomous vehicles, is the role in freight and logistics. And that's a sector in which there's a lot of interest in autonomizing these operations because of obviously cost savings, and where even if we were restricted to operating vehicles on controlled highways, that's where a lot of trucking happens. And so that's sort of another domain where it might happen sooner rather than later, and can't say exactly when, but that's one of the areas that's being pushed to expect sort of maybe be a leader on seeing advances in freight before it necessarily gets across to passenger transportation.
Great. That was very helpful. So I think we should thank our panel members for giving us a lot to think about starting off our session today. So the rest of our time this afternoon is really for the members of the commission to hear from members of the public. As I said before, we welcome comments on everything, but our report to the governor, which is due December 1st, is going to focus on laying out facts and trends, laying out some plausible scenarios, and making some recommendations. It's not really going to focus on near-term operations, on specific projects, on legislation that's currently in front of the legislature. So We look forward to hearing from members of the audience. Did we have people sign? How are we doing it logistically?
Yeah, should be numbers, right? So Mike can make your way forward with number one. The first half dozen or so numbers we've given out. After that, we'll just allow people to come up to the microphone in that orderly fashion. Great.
Hi. I think some of the assumptions everyone's been making about autonomous vehicles is that they'll operate on roadways. And it might be interesting that Leominster, Mass. Is moving forward with building a level 6 autonomous network. And so level 6 autonomous networks means that...
I'm sorry, could you introduce yourself so we have it for the record and so the commission members know?
Sure. My name is Mike Stanley. I'm the CEO of Transit X. We're based in Boston, and we're doing a pod network, privately financed.
Great. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, so Leominster's moving forward. So groundbreaking should be slated for next year, and there's 10 cities outside that are also moving forward with this. These are fleets of privately financed autonomous electric vehicles providing door-to-door service, but they don't need the roadways, right? So in this level of 6 autonomous, every vehicle on the network is autonomous. So it's grade separated, it's ultralight. So all these issues with capacity, congestion, pollution, because it's solar powered transportation. And what's interesting is when you make these very small, lightweight vehicles that are high capacity, now you have this thing where there's an assumption that you need multiple modes of transportation, right? You need the buses and the trains, and you need the cars, and you need the bikes. You need all these different modes. But each of those modes is a different network, and each of those networks implies a whole cost structure for supporting them, which means it's very costly, right? So that's why, and you have competing networks. So you have like the Ubers and the Lyfts and the mass transit. And so these all increase your costs. And so you have private competing with public. So And it's hard to get network effects because each one is independent. So you have these overlapping, competing, costly networks. And there's certainly assumptions that a lot of people make that you need large vehicles. Large vehicles are necessary for high capacity. So the system plan for Leominster means that on these very small networks, you can achieve 30,000 passengers per hour per direction, which is 3 times the capacity of the red line. It's about 16 passenger lanes on the highway, and 30,000 boardings per hour in 100 yards of curb space. So this is providing accessible transportation for both passengers and freight, and achieves a Vision Zero safety, because the way to achieve Vision Zero is we know what it is, and you need to have grade separated, fully automated level 6 networks. It's inherently unsafe to have a 80,000-pound vehicle sharing the road with a 40-pound vehicle that's a bicycle. That's inherently unsafe. You can't achieve Vision Zero with that. But if you have a grade-separated network, then you can. So, and so you're talking about a low-cost solution, that the solution is so low cost, guess what? It can be privately financed. So you're not asking for public financing. So all these things are like, well, who's going to pay for it? It's like, we will. The private sector will pay for it because it's so low cost. Now we can use debt financing. You can use the investment banks, the private equity, the private sovereign wealth funds to be able to pay for entire large networks. So for example, I had a proposal I sent to Eric that was for a 332-mile network for just around the Amherst and Springfield area that would connect it to Worcester. So again, it's about a $2.2 billion system, privately financed, that would provide door-to-door service in this area. And so what I'm trying to say is the status quo right now is heavily weighted towards existing modes. That's what mass.gov is. Okay, you have your rail silo and your car silo and your buses and your horse. Well, okay, you don't have horses anymore, but it's so weighted to the status quo they can't see beyond it. Like, what happens if there isn't a mass.gov, if you don't need public financing for these high capacity networks? Cars are not going to be equitable because of the too high costs that have been talked about here. So that's what we're talking about, is a privately financed metropolitan networks to serve suburban, urban, and rural passengers, freight, and passengers, and that we're looking to operate along state roads, which requires easements from the mass.gov. So this is the future where most of the transportation infrastructure may not be through mass.gov. It might be a privately run and operated transit network that's providing fleets of autonomous electric, solar-powered vehicles. And what I would recommend is that immediately that Massachusetts needs to adopt something like what they have in RoadX in Colorado. So the Colorado Department of Transportation has the ability to accept unsolicited proposals from private industry that can solve these issues. But right now, I don't see that. I don't see that MassDOT is really open to new ways and new forms of looking at things. You can also look at LA Metro, and they're also very open. I've had much more openness when I go overseas, where I've gone to the Philippines, Africa, India. I've done a world tour where they understand what it means to leapfrog. And they're looking at their road networks, their clogged road networks, and they're saying, like, how do we leapfrog beyond this? Because there's not enough capacity. Doesn't matter if you have buses or BRT or microtransit. It doesn't scale. The roads don't scale. So think beyond roads. And that's what we're doing. So roads, where we're going, you don't need roads. Thank you.
Thank you. Number 2, I guess. Anyone else sign up?
It's like the deli.
If you didn't plan on speaking, but you'd like to, you're still welcome to. We're here to listen. Not a lot of speakers here. Please.
I just wanted to, James Sproul, the Sproul Company. I'm an autonomous vehicle advocate and working with the city to take a look at pilot projects as well as educational opportunities with the technology. I wanted to piggyback on Eric's comments on the transportation. At a conference last summer, there was a lot of conversation about platooning for large vehicles on highways. It was interesting back at that point to learn that the transportation companies had already made their ROI investments and analysis, and they're ready to take advantage of the technology, provided that we can have a platform in which they can operate at. So if you're looking at either the AV working group or at this commission here, that may be an area in which you can consider implementing possibly faster than you might in an urban environment. So it's just food for thought for you as you take a look at what technologies are currently available that have the support of private industry and have a record of being able to operate safely on the highway. So I just wanted to piggyback on that point. And then also, to be considered as part of the future is what do we do with the educational component? How do our high school students that want to go on and be able to attain these good jobs in the service sectors, how do we begin to infuse the technology of autonomy into a curriculum where a high school student, upon graduation, can possibly go right into industry, not have to require, a 4-year advanced degree in engineering to be able to work in that school. So there's all kinds of things opening up very quickly from at the curriculum level in high school that 10 to 20 years down the road could be an important component and help provide jobs for those here in the area. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other audience members who maybe weren't planning to speak but would like to make a comment or respond to something they've heard?
Hi, Bill Carey with Liberty Mutual, the corporate strategy team. We've been doing some research, keeping up on autonomous vehicle trends as well. One of the things that we had a question on was around the infrastructure required to support AVs, specifically like for cities to set up things like, transmitters, receivers, kind of smart traffic control technology. Where is the Commonwealth in this process? Is it still going to be in that very long-term future? Is there a way for either the city of Boston or other places in the state to react to this sooner and try to take advantage of of moving first earlier?
So, I mean, in general, the commission isn't focusing on short term, but I will note that there is actually an RFP on the street for the adoption of an adaptive signal network in the Seaport area of Boston as a way of starting to get our hands on the technology and understand it better as a joint project between the city of Boston and mass.gov. But you raised a very important question, which is not the part of the technology that's going to reside in the car, but the part of the technology that's going to be on the public infrastructure. Thank you. Please introduce yourself.
Tom Ryden from Mass Robotics. Just a question. Most of the discussion has been focused on ground-based vehicles, and yet we hear a lot of autonomous air vehicles, and also the combination of using ground and air to do that last mile delivery. Is the Commission looking at air vehicles in part of your study, and is that going to be included in the report?
I think one of our questions is should be. We've actually debated that, so if you have perspective on that, we'd love to hear it.
So I would actually strongly encourage that you include drones and UAVs in the discussion and in the future. I think it's going to be a vital part of the complete solution, and we're going to see that continue to grow. Most of the major delivery companies are using or looking at using drone-based delivery for that last mile, so it's going to be part of the transportation solution in some respects. So I'd love to see you guys include that in the discussion.
Great.
Thanks.
Other thoughts, questions, comments? All right, well, if there aren't any, then I guess we will close the listening session. We appreciate everyone else coming to listen as well as us. There will be 4 additional listening sessions held around the Commonwealth. Feel free to go onto the website of the Commission on the Future of Transportation. They're all listed there, and there's also information, I think, in the back of the room. And please encourage other folks you know who are interested in these topics to either just email the Commission and file their thoughts, point us to information on facts and trends and other things that we should be looking at, and participate in future listening sessions. Thanks for coming this afternoon.